So out of 6 collections he is known to have authored, sadly, I don't think any of this is available, right? Any of this is available. I have with myself 2 photocopies, one of his, oft spoken of debut collection, Luster, full stop poems. Many people call it Luster poems, but it's Luster full stop poems. Courtesy of Peradeniya University Library. When I came across it, it was not in a very good condition. Leaves were falling. Probably they have kind of since rebound it. That and his collection much later. His collection much later, right? So Nelum has it with her. I think that's the university copy, Nelum. Is that correct?
Yes, I borrowed it from my.
So there's only one of that. Please do not think.
No, I wouldn't tamper with it.
Do not think the unthinkable, right? That's the one there. And of course, there's the other collection I have brought into this discussion is a very instructive collection. It's called O Regal Blood, published in 75 or 76, 2 years before he died. O Regal Blood. The whole collection has 6 pages. That's why it's very iconic for me, for someone to think of publishing a book that consists of half a dozen pages, because nowadays you can't do this because there are many technicalities involved. They don't issue an ISBN for a book of 6 pages, but then it also tells us about what poetry used to be. Maybe there's a greater degree of autonomy and spontaneity to it, right, at that time. Also, Wikkramasinghe, as I note in my understanding, is a poet that's he's one of those endangered species. In classroom material, he's one of those endangered species because he's fast becoming extinct. He's going out of syllabi, right? My understanding is that, or at least the only place I have seen Lakdas Wikkramasinha deeply studied at a university kind of atmosphere was at Peradeniya when during my time when Dr. Mihal Fernando used to teach some of those courses. I think he took some effort to take the discussion on Wikkramasinghe quite deep. My feeling is that, or at least my understanding, my reading of the Sri Lankan situation is that he's one of those poets who is going out. And one of the reasons is that perhaps Wikkramasinghe has some controversial views expressed, or at least there is no guarantee these are his views, but there are some representations that might come across as controversial, especially in the gender department, right? And also his poetry at one level is tangibly very masculinist, if you may use that word. And also there's a very dominant strain of violence that cuts across his body of poetry. His poetry is very violent, so there's a whole spectrum of violence in some of the poems, and probably a few examples we will share in our meeting. A whole spectrum of violence, starting from homicide, suicide, violence, sex, people drowning, people stabbing, guns, bombs, knives, right? People consuming acid, a lot of violence, child molestation, at least, right? Child molestation, power exploitation. To start off with this gentleman, Michael Ondaatje, right? Running in the Family. So people know this book as well. Probably you brushed past. You had some kind of passing acquaintance with this book, Running in the Family. Very few foreigners truly knew where they were. This is a reference to Sri Lanka. And Michael Ondaatje is saying this, right? Apart from Knox and Leonard Woolf, very few foreigners truly knew where they were. I still believe the most beautiful alphabet was created by the Sinhalese. A lot of Orientalist imagery coming up. That's a warning up front. The insect of ink curves into a shape that is almost sickle, spoon, eyelid. Letters are washed blunt glass which betray no jaggedness. Sanskrit was governed by verticals, but its sharp grid features were not possible in Ceylon. Here the ola leaves which people wrote on were too brittle. Slight line would cut apart the leaf, and so a curling alphabet was. That's why our alphabet is round, if you were wondering, right? Because the ola leaf would get hurt otherwise. Okay, the bones of a lover's spine, whatever. There are three Sinhala letters in the middle of this English book. I wonder why. Let's see. When I was 5, the only time in my life handwriting was meticulous. I sat in a tropical classroom, learned the letters C and N. I wonder whether it was taught the other way around and he remembers it this way, right? C and N and not N and C. Repeating them page after page, how to write self-portrait of language, move. So very, very random letters. This probably reads very cute to someone reading this book outside Sri Lanka, right? Lid on a cooking utensil that takes the shape of fire. Years later, looking into a biology textbook, I came across a whole page depicting the small bones in the body and recognized shapes and forms of the first alphabet I ever copied from Kumarodya's first grade reader. Right? But I'm also reflecting here on the kind of Orientalist, exoticist take on this kind of era, the era Wikkramasinha lived in, right? Starting from the alphabet to actual people who lived in that era, as it appears in something like Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family, right? Thousands were killed, police and army, while the Kalani and Mahaveli rivers moved to the sea, heavy with bodies. These drawings were destroyed, so that the book is now the only record of them. In his early collections, he uses the name Lakdas Wikkramasinha, right? Broken into 3, Lakdas. So I will share, I think in the material I shared, it's there. We will share it again. The front page of Luster poems, right? It goes as Lakdas Wikkramasinha. But some of his later work comes as Lakdasa Wikkramasinha. Okay, so Wikkramasinghe, the spelling is consistent, but in his early work, you have Wikkrama and Singha. Later work, Wikkramasinghe. So people call him Lakdasa, that's fine. My feeling is, I don't know, I would like to table this as a hypothesis. People can probably work on it. I wonder whether in the 1960s, at one level, because one of Wikkramasinghe's let's say one of his focal points in his career as an artist, as we will discuss, is to try and develop an alternative poetic sensibility, which is alternative to the British poetic sensibility, right? We look at some of these poems. So I won't call it a Sri Lankan sensibility. It's a very palpably Sinhala sensibility, right? He was working towards. It's very Sinhala. So I wonder whether he, at that point in his life, was influenced by movements like the Hela Haula, for example, right? So in the same way, Arya Sena Ashubodha became Arisen Ahubudu, right? Whether Lakdasa wanted to become Lakdas, right? But he didn't call him Vikumsiha, he didn't do that, right? Thankfully. But so look, there's a lot. What I'm trying to say is that bugs us about this guy. There's a lot we can do. But as an answer to this question, what I can say is some of his early work appears as Lakdas Wikkramasinha, but definitely later work Lakdasa Wikkramasinha. And when people write about him in the academy, they refer to him and they call him Lakdasa Wikkramasinha. Okay? And if you actually go through this collection, it's about 50 pages. There are some of these poems which we will talk about in detail that are very, decidedly anti-colonial. Some of the first, Nelum has the collection with some of the poems that come in the first installment, the first section, right? They decisively turn towards native consciousness, Sinhala consciousness. There are a couple of poems which are written in imitation of pre-colonial, right, poetry tradition available in the island. Couple of other poems that draw on folk memory, and also there's a poem written in imitation of Dasko Nadikaram, right? Dasko Nadikaram or Gascoigne, or this guy who was supposedly in the Kandian court, right? Who kind of got into a bit of trouble, supposedly having an affair with the queen, I think, of the palace, right? French guy. Five or six lines, right? He says something like, look, the main idea of his poem is, look, if I did something, I did it for a worthy cause. And here I am, starving without food or whatever, because of this queen, that kind of poem. The point I'm trying to make is that here is a collection dedicated straight away to this woman of feudal roots, clearly, right? Blood of centuries. But a poem that has a mixture of expressions that are very clearly, right, in search of the kind of native, local heritage, inheritance that seems to have been displaced because of the colonial encounter, but also poems that are very outright anti-colonial. Gamini Hattatugam has written this. I'll just look at or direct your attention to a few passages, right, of this, just to get a sense of what his contemporaries felt about Wikkramasinha. The last paragraph is what I want to look at on the first column. Lakdasa, I feel, always needed something to explode about, right? And the awful or awesome passion working inside him had to find a ripe enough substance to precipitate it naturally, inevitably, and justifiably. And the best explosion, right? The best explosion did not come about over a private traumatic experience, but through the largest confrontation that his just anger, his enraged humanity, his bleeding compassions could experience, right? From his response to a whole culture and civilization that had made him also commit, as he thought, cultural treason. I think his most valuable, his really momentous poetic statement surfaces in Don't Talk to Me About Matisse, this poem. Now, very often we come across, there's almost near consensus across critics and readers of this poem that this has a very strong anti-colonial vibe. I'll read a little bit more from this passage, the one that comes after. He is the man who had absorbed something of the best essence of Western culture, who had these great artists at his fingertips and could appreciate European art genuinely, but could yet denounce the fundamental lie that a based culture based on exploitation, plunder, and the massacre of the innocents could practice and foster in the form of aesthetic, cultural, philosophic, and sociological concepts, right? So the idea that, on one hand, we have European high art, which passes off for the holier than thou, whatever, the kind of fetishistic response it has nurtured sometimes in people like us as well, right? But underlying that is a kind of a plunder, massacre, genocide, exploitation, appropriation, right? That doesn't go acknowledged in any way, at least in these circles. So he tries to draw attention to that accordingly. He calls the bluff that separates and isolates art and culture from the brute facts of history, right? So things like where we say art for art's sake, right? Art existing devoid or divorced from politics, society, history. So he kind of turns on that kind of statement. In this poem, Lakdas achieves a masterly integration of feeling, and thought, so adapting his very personal voice for public effect, achieving such an intensity of visual and oral effect, finest fruit of his imagining, that he brings to its climax a rich and shattering power, right? And the poem ends in this way. But what is important here for me, at least in having our present conversation, is how he was looked on and received in his contemporary circle by someone like Hattu Wikkrama. These were people who knew one another closely. This stop is very crucial because this is a note that comes at the end of luster poems. So right at the end, there's this note which, for many people, for many readers of Wikkramasingha, is like a artistic manifesto, right? An artistic manifesto. Any article or document on Wikkramasingha's poetry has a reference to this note, right? So 2/3 of the poems I wrote between August and October 65 are in this book. The section Luster, so the book has 5 sections. Luster poems, it has 5 installments, various subtitles. So there's a section called Luster. Marks the face of Sinhala sensibility. I go on to the exploration of my persona and deadly position, which is that I have come to realize I am using the language of the most despicable and loathsome people on earth. I have no wish to extend its life and range or enrich its tonality. To write in English is a form of cultural treason. I have had for the future to think of a way of circumventing this treason. I propose to do this by making my writing entirely immoralist and destructive. Right now, this is the section that gets quoted. People who want to prove that Wikkramasingha has a very distinct anti-empire, anti-colonial, kind of vibe. Now, I want to actually add to this because I look at this slightly differently. Because if you look at Wikkramasingha's writing, I have already said that there are 2 very distinct patterns you can identify. One is the anti-empire response, but also, as I have already shared, at one level, and I won't say this is a full-time engagement, but there are some poems, there is a definite branch where he tries to foster, where he tries to energize an alternative poetic idiom, an idiom that is that breaks away, that turns away from the British poetic idiom. At one level, I feel that these lines are actually addressed to some of Wikkramasingha's contemporaries who still wrote in that British English poetic vein, right? Because people who have studied a little bit of literature, Sri Lankan literature, the other guy whose name gets coupled up with Wikkramasingha in syllabuses and all is Patrick Fernando, right? And a point we very often associate with Patrick Fernando is that his poetry is very classical to the touch, right? And then we have others like Yasmin Gunaratna writing at the time, Ashley Halpe writing at the time, people whose poetry that have survived for consumption, by us. People like Anne Ranasinghe come a little bit later. People like Anne Ranasinghe, Jean Avasanayakam, these people come a little bit later, 1970s, 1980s. So I'm wondering, I'm thinking out loud whether part of the deal here is how you actually choose a vehicle to express yourself poetically, and whether his problem is with some of his contemporaries. Part 2 is also very instructive to the kind of guy he is, right? The kind of guy he is like a 24-year-old man publishing this. And he says something like this: I wish to comment on a few of my poems, which other people may denounce if they wish, but not criticize. You can denounce my poetry, but you can't criticize them, right? Memorial. This is one of the poems. I have it on the list. Memorial is the greatest Asian poem in English, right? Memorial is the greatest Asian poem in English. It's like one page. Now look at this. The one right at the bottom, right? Hearts of Granite is a compression of a long poem on my ancestors that I will write ultimately in Sinhala. I don't think he ever did that. The poem relates to my maternal forebears, a confused and inadequate account is Cyrus D.F. Abekon's A History of the Ancient Pinto Jayawardena Family, immediate descendants and relatives, right? I'll just give a very short ladybird summary of what happens in Hearts in Granite. Poem is there, we'll come to that later. So this is a poem where the heart of the poem is an attack by the Portuguese, right? Through the Portuguese engaging with some of the interior kingdoms, marching through Sitavaka, and some of the references, even there are references to battles in the peripheries of the Kandian kingdom, right? So this is datable to late 16th century, 1590s to 1620, that period. So once again, it takes us back to that discussion of turning to a consciousness pre-colonial, right? And the kind of identity that he searches for himself through that engagement. So this is Memorial coming up next, right? Now this poem actually, until I think very recent, no one really took this very seriously, this poem. It's there in the collection. And because the guy alludes to it in the note, everyone quite vaguely or adjacently thinks this has something to do with colonialism, right? Whatever. Now, 2015, I think, about 7 years ago, Nihal Fernando wrote an article, right? Partly responding to Anne Marie de Silva, right? But also in that, in one section of the article, Nihal Fernando offered some new insights into this poem, right? He located the events mentioned in this poem to 1915, the time of the Muslim Sinhala riots in 1915. I'll just quickly read this through if it's okay. I won't be like taking too much time, but I feel it's easy for me to make reference if this has been verbalized in some way. Let a few dead names suffice for the sable dead, shot in their compounds, in their funeral gardens, suddenly bereft of Kenna and the odors of Pichamal, of Pichamal, and the pullulating dust wailing with sorrows. Now these words carry no purple menacers, and cry we cry in annals, right, and avalanches for Sinyoappu, Simang, Jiris, Punchinilame, for Ampe Romanis, and the lady Sabarat Etana, who sowed her 50th year, reaping paddy in fields enflamed with sun. For those shot on the banks of the Algod River, for those who were flogged in the sommerness of the Kalani, for those driven and shot on the Vanavaha rail track that rode the sovereign trains of cinnamon, right? And so on and so forth. The second stanza, one reference that is important to me. In the night, death struck our folk down and desecrated us. Death, at the hand of moor and sepoy, had more candor than its aftermath. Our memorials walked sewn fast to the shoes of our greatest patriot, not passing the cunning corridors, the pallor of ministers and parliament. Right? I'll stop there now, coming back to some of the sections. So the names given in the first stanza, they come across as very, commonplace, ordinary names of villagers. Okay, probably people who suffered, who were killed, right, during the 1915 riots. So what Nihal Fernando does in his article is he actually gives, he locates these names in history. So he uses for his purpose the book Armand D'Souza wrote about the 1915 riots, where the deaths of these people are actually mentioned. These are like ordinary villagers, and violence that took place near the Algoda River, Vanavahala rail track. This gives us more context. So this is somewhere closer to Kalaniya, right? Vanavaha probably is Vanavasala, right? Vanavasala, which is in the periphery of that Kalani, that territory, right? So this is violence that definitely took in the shape of British, let's say, counteraction against some of the emergency that was that was brought on by the 1915 incident. Interestingly, there's a reference to Moor and Sepoy. So my feeling is Wikkramasinghe has also a very decisive, he's very decided where his allegiance is in the case. So it's against the Moor, right? And the reference to memorial here, now this is what Fernando does, because when we say memorial, you and I, what we think and what everyone has thought all this time, memorial is what we erect when a person is dead, right? That tombstone, whatever, that is what we call a memorial. But Fernando suggests that memorial actually means something like a letter, right? A petition. So the reference here is actually to a petition, which was taken to London, which was smuggled to London, as legend informs us, hidden in the shoe, right, of our greatest patriot. Who is this greatest patriot? This is probably E.W. Perera, right? We know this story, how he took a petition so that he can walk through customs without being apprehended. It was confiscated, it was concealed, right, in the sole of his shoe. So the reference is to that, the greatest poem, the greatest Asian poem. So this is it, right? Now this is a much more straightforward attack. This two-line poem, right? Two-line poem in it also appears in Luster poems, the British Council. When they kiss my arse, O muse, save me from the clap, right? So the clap here is sexually transmittable, right? Venereal disease, it's slang or syphilis, right? That kind of. So when they kiss my ass, save me from the clap, right? So Nilum has shared that journal, right?
When we were students, he had actually shared his article with us, so I have that.
Thank you. This is like brilliant, right? It's
Also
good
have
for.
the article.
Sorry?
Also that Damini
Article, right? So that is from 1917. That's available in Navasilu, if I remember right. It comes in a Navasilu edition. So while staying with, so a poem like the British Council, right? When they kiss my ass. So this is kind of a very succinct, very summary analysis of what people like those in the British Council are doing in Sri Lanka in 1965. Okay, so this is 17 years after independence apparently was granted. So what are they doing? So they are probably neo-colonial agents, because the reference to VDs or venereal disease is very important here. It's also a kind of a reference that recurs in Wickramasinghe's poetry. Colonialism equals disease. So they, because I think it is quite widely documented that some diseases like syphilis, for example, right, they were introduced to certain territories of the world by colonial enterprise. Again, because we spoke about Matisse earlier, we spoke about Gauguin earlier, and because we will talk about him again when we come to that poem proper. So these people actually had diseases like this. So here the implication seems to be that the British Council or that kind of institute is an agent of continuing empire or continuing imperialism or neo-imperialism in places like Sri Lanka, right? So I think until very recently, probably it's not the case anymore. I'm not very sure. Even things like IELTS exams, right? Which is very neo-imperialist if you really think about it, right? IELTS exams, like very neo-colonial. The what do you call it? The mm, monopoly, the monopoly of the IELTS trade was with the British Council, right? Probably now it's different. I want to change the tempo a little bit. I have a couple of poems here which actually demonstrate a lot of violence up front. Okay, so see, so the disciple is one of the poems that, so all these three poems are from Luster, right? I like this poem. I used to teach Wikkramasinha at university. At Javadanapur, I taught this course. I taught a course on Sri Lankan writing, and Wikkramasinha was a main kind of a highlight. And I always tell the students in that course that this poem comes too late in their career because that course was slotted in the third year. By that time, it's too late. This should be taught in the first year, right? Disciple. The body you and 5 policemen pull out of the bearer, right? That you saw early this morning floating in the lake had at 7 o'clock in the twilight a mind thinking. My loyal disciple follows me. He's at my footsteps, at my back, my disciple follows me. But his mind was not too quick to know the knife I buried in his back. His mind was too slow to think. Like the saffron light I flashed before him, that I showed the way for him, for you. Only the knife I buried in his back knew. I follow no one. Knew and was not too late to feel. Right? Like what we do to all disciples that follow us, right? You kind of give the illusion of the disciple can actually go past you, and then you put the knife on his back, right? There's also another poem which is not here. That poem is titled "I Follow No One." So I think, Nelum, if you check what you have with you, there's a poem called "I Follow No One." It kind of couples this. So in that, the narrator says, I don't follow anyone. I go my way. I follow the instincts of my blood and something else, right? So the idea of I don't know, knifing, the idea of backstabbing, the idea of homicide. Second poem, as I go down, I really hope there's no pun intended when Wikkramasinha wrote this, right? As I go down, they await me with daggers at the turn of the path, ground strewn with leaves. From the hut of Sandhya, stifling odor of her still drugs me, and then as her breasts loomed over my face, the darkness swelled, like now the dusk. Only the blades glitter, opaque glitter of her chain, dark in my mouth. Her cruel teeth laughed at my groin triumphantly. Beads dazed me at my groin. And then what happens? They surround me, stab me like horns. I, returning from an agony more cruel and white. My blood is, yeah, my blood is black now, and it seeps down my sides. Right, the thought trail kind of gets garbled. I go down as they like wolves surround me. Hollow eyes watch me now. Sandhya, my blood is an empty pool. See in its Sandhya, the empty sky, how I fear it. Show your face in my blood, Sandhya. Before the empty pool, the hollow sky, how I fear it. Right? Ah, let my blood thicken with lust. Show your face in it. Ah, that I will stand again. A lot of violence. So look, lot of sex in it as well, right? A lot of sex built into that idea of I don't know, stabbing. Probably there are. It goes quite seamlessly with masculinist sexual connotations. You can identify with that word or that verb, right? But there's a lot of entanglement, passion, violence, lust, all that. And then this poem, the third one, Turn Me Over. And also, if you take some of these poems in tandem, you might even feel that the narrative voice moves from victor to victim, from exploiter to the exploited, right? To the architect of violence, to the actual the vulnerable victim of that violence. So there's a kind of a shifting of the perspective with which the poet kind of frames these narratives. So turn me over, in the end, it is a lawman looking down on me, a policeman encircled on the ground by the feet of a crowd. And I am trying to say that the 4 holes on my chest, they do not matter, but please, I cannot bear the sight of this crowd peering over each other on me and muttering, and the lawman with a small notebook. So please, turn me over on my face. I would taste the dust before I die and see the color of it, typo, I think, no? See the color of it on my eyes so close. Hear the shuffling sound of dust without seeing the feet of those that make it. See so close how my blood-flecked saliva is taken in as the earth will take me in. And know that you see with amazed pleasure 4 rich red flowers open on my back, right? So you can see a kind of overlap also, what I said earlier, between and among these poems, right? But very violent. And these are kind of examples of a more overreaching tendency in some of the poems we find in Luster. All right. Violence yet again, but this is a bit of a disturbing proposition, this poem, to a servant girl, right? Because at one level, as I said earlier, Wikkramasinha has a obsession or a fixation with Valauva, that kind of feudal, semi-feudal power structures. But there are other poems where he actually turns on that, same formation. So in this collection, I have included 2 such poems, right? So one is this, To a Servant Girl. Then there's the other poem, The Death of Ashanti, right? I'll be looking at both in greater detail. Now, here in this poem, what happens is a servant girl is being physically molested, beaten, right? There is a master and a mistress. The mistress is the one who's trying to harm the girl. The master is reading the paper or something, right? He pretends not to see. The poet tells the girl to somehow bear up the hurt, the pain, and to be patient for a few years. Because in a few years, he says, the mistress will be, she would have lost her physical, the vibe. She would have lost the vibe in a few years. She grows old. Then the master will turn to you. And you can have sex with the master. In that way, you can punish the mistress, right? So it's a very, very violent proposition, really. Okay? So little girl of 8, on your knees, under the rattan of the armchair. As your chin touches the floor, your eyes are black slots of fear. On a face tattooed with the eras of the rattan web, seeing the motionless eyes of your mistress. Little girl of 8, how your limp stomach draws in with a gasp as she takes a step nearer your face. In her hand is a ruler, in your hand a rag. In your hard effort, little one, your loose jacket falls forward on your neck and shows a back gashed, festering. Your mistress will later, in the kitchen, splash salted water and ash on those grooves. Daily at your shows, little one, is all emotion of your tender years spent in a hand that hurts in healing and in anger. Little girl, now your master spread-legged on the armchair growls that you be silent, threatens to twist your neck when you cry aloud, animal in your pain. Girl, bear these years growing. Your mistress ages, 10 years hence. So she's 8 by the time she's 18, okay? 10 years hence, you will have her invalid in bed, in the smoke-filled room with a lifeless waste, without frills and lasers, dying of the slow poison of you and him. Then your master's mouth will pucker on your flesh, avidly to your disdain, and on sufferance pleasure. His tongue will move over those gleaming wheels on your flesh. Furrows now that hurt will be kissed then. Right? So these are the kind of poems that kind of warranted Wikkramasinghe to fast disappear from syllabuses in Sri Lanka, right? So this is something that won't be tolerated too much. Death of Ashanti. Now this is a game. So here we have a woman, Ashanti. Her place in the household is not very, there is no, we don't know for sure. She seems to be something between a servant or a poor relative, right? A poor relative or a servant seems to be exploited physically, and her labor, right? Sexually. She has a 7-month baby in her belly. She's consumed acid and died. Right? September 1974, the death of Ashanti. So for people who know the poem, you know there's a twist towards the end, right? A girl, I knew her. Saw her once or twice, eating or washing the pots and pans. Used to sleep on a camp bed in the hall. She was perhaps used by my cousin, a private in the army, put to look after the pigs. Right? He had a share in the house, being the last male in the line. For the sake of blood, I remember, I nearly married his epileptic sister, the one who 2 months back set fire to the leased out firewood shed in the garden one night using kerosene. Ashanti was different. And I don't know how many she'd given herself. Sorry, Ashanti was different. I don't know how many she'd given herself to keep alive. And a 2-year-old kid she had. But yesterday I heard she drunk acid, raising a great marsh howl inside the old house as it burnt her insides, and she died. 7-month baby in her belly. No one even wished to know who the father was. Perhaps there were too many. Perhaps it was my cousin, the pig bearer of a name, petering out in such maledictions. I noticed her earlobes. They were longer than usual, as if gold rings of great intricacy and weight had hung from them. And then the familiar black stork danced in the hall once more, among an army of spines, an army of men centuries old, who watched and gloated as she lay heaped upon my lap, packed with white seed. I think that last movement in the poem, starting from I noticed her earlobes, right? I think that refers to Ashanti, who, according to the poet, was quite openly exploited by the menfolk, right? In the tradition of how women in a similar situation were exploited in that kind of setting, semi-feudal, that kind of setting over centuries. So I think the last movement exposes to us that even the poet has been with Ashanti, right? So I noticed her yellow, brings us very closer to Ashanti. The familiar black stork dancing in the hall, I think, has a suggestive, there's suggestive innuendo there. The black stork, right? Phallic kind of imagery there. The men of centuries old, watching and gloating. Whenever I read this line, what comes to my mind are those portraits of feudal ancestors we often see, right? So these are the portraits in that in-between space, the hall where she used to sleep. So under their gaze, she's again subjected to sex, and she lay heaped upon my lap, packed with white seed. Once again, it's unmistakable reference there, packed with white seed. So even in Monica, just a second, even in that earlier poem, the one to do with sun there, you have that reference to, seed. Once again, that reference is there. Yes, Monica, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's also interesting how he positions all the men as being almost below him in some form. I don't know whether it's by class or what it is, but in that last turn, he's also watched by it's among an army of spies, and I always thought it had something to do with books. So even the educated, the poet, the writer who is esteemed above the pig, the guy who cares for the pigs in the army, is still part of this violation that just happens over and over again.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really separate the educated from the poor or the walau, that kind of.
Yeah. And also on top of that, for me personally, like when I read this poem, the punch is where, he starts off at a glance. We see that he, as Monica said, positions himself holier than thou, at least to the, at least to us reading it for the first time. But then it comes to a conclusion where we realize he's also one of them, right? He's also one of them, or he positions himself in that long tradition to which he has been born, right? So in a way implicated in a kind of violence from which you can't break away. So these two poems, To a Servant Girl and Death of Ashanti, at their heart, right, we have an energy that actually turns on the semi-feudal economy and the culture of the Walau, right? Now this one, Discarded Tins, is an extension of the same line of thought, but a little bit more, let's say, proactive, at least in sentiment. Because here what happens is, the poem is written in 1970. The year is also a bit important, 1970. Wikkramasinha is actually, he's propagating violent revolution or a violent disruption to the social order, right? 1970. So here there are slum tenements, there are slums. Then on the other side we have houses of the socially affluent and economically viable, right, people. One category, they consume tin products, whatever, right, luxury items. They discard the remains at the foot of the slums, and during the rainy season there are mosquitoes right, bred in those empty tins. What the poet is suggesting is that the people of the slums, they should take the discard tins into their tenements, make bombs out of them, come and throw them back at the well-to-do, the haves, right? It's that kind of suggestion. I'll read just a part of it, okay? I'll just read just a part. It's not a long poem either, because I want to raise 2 points related to the poem. Of the discarded empty tin of milk in the refuse, in the rainy season breeding mosquitoes. Of the discarded cigarette tin, tobacco tin, numerous other tins are made the last returns of the community of the slums to their fortunate urban brothers, their own rich brothers, their enemies who masquerade with their women without having to pay 10 rupees or 15 or 20 or 2. For them are the numerous discarded tins taken into the back room of this tenement and this hovel and this gaudy mansion of the businessman with his 5 women with huge bellies. For them are held in these tins, now sleek and silver, wrapped in paper, the terrible explosions that must. So it's not even suggesting that, it's not even suggesting that these people should take the tins and, make bombs out of it. It's like a prophecy, really. It's like a forecast. This is what's going to happen, right? Wrapped in paper, terrible explosions that must happen. The most important line is the last one. Continually happen in the wrong places, right? So because we have especially the social underclass or the deprived, the disadvantaged quarters of society, where they go at one another, there is great, well, look, even today, I would say, if you look at the left movement, that is the main observation you can make. There are like too many divisions. And very often the cause of the division is being unable to determine whether the Great October Revolution happened in October or November, that kind of thing. And, divisions and the explosions happen in the wrong places. There's no coordination of energy. Whereas the explosion should be against the class of the oppressor, right? Directed that way. Now, interesting observation about this poem is made again by Nihal Fernando in that article Nelum shared with us, right? Because there are poems like this where Wikkramasinha seems to suggest violent social restructuring. But Fernando suggests that after 1971, he never wrote this way. This is all before 1971. This poem is written in 1970. After 71, there is no poem that. So probably why is the question? So one suggestion is that Wikkramasinha has this ambiguous response. His response is at best ambiguous in terms of the feudal, right? The feudal configuration, right? What the feudal economy. So it's a so he in principle he has a humanistic approach, but then there is also a deep obsession, fixation, a kind of an immersion from which he can't break out. And what happened in 71 was probably unexpected, right? You can be leftist, but you don't have to be JVP. You can be leftist, but you don't have to propagate, let's say, revolution as the next step for society, right? So probably, so there is also the discarded tins. I want to look at a couple of poems because I raised this point as a main point in our initial, when we set the groundwork for the discussion, right? Because I spoke about his experiment with fostering or forging an alternative Sinhalese local poetic idiom. So I want to look at 2 poems. So one is The Cobra. This is a poem probably people of my generation, like Sumedha, might be familiar with. Your great hood was like a flag hung up there in the village. Endlessly the people came to Veragoda, watched you, your eyes like braziers, standing somewhat afar. They stood before you in obeisance. Death, the power of the paramitas, took you to heaven, however. The sky vertical is where you are now, shadowing the sun, curling around and around my mind. They whisper death stories. But it was only my woman, Dunkirinya, the very lamp of my heart, that died. I don't have any original thoughts about this poem, but I can just share points shared by informed people over time, right? So at the outset, so this can be a little bit confusing, because one theory is that what happens here is that a man has killed a cobra that has come to the house and attacked his wife, who is also dead, right? And in a knee-jerk kind of reaction, he's actually killed the cobra as well. Contending version is that the cobra is not dead. The cobra is actually there, alive, right? But the woman is dead. For me, it doesn't matter whether the cobra is dead or alive. Okay, your great hood was like a flag. So the people who say the cobra is alive, what they say is, if the cobra is dead, the cobra's hood won't be like a flag, right? A dead cobra would be like this. But then it doesn't matter, because what he says is your great hood was like a flag. It's what you call a simile, right? And a flag is something we often, I mean, if you pass, especially I think in a remote setting, it stands out because of it contrasts with the rest of the ecology. But a flag is something that draws your attention, grabs your attention. So your hood is something that grabbed attention. It was like a flag hung up in the village, grabbing attention. People came to Veragoda. They watched, right? Watched you from afar. You don't get close to the cobra, whether it's dead or alive, right? It's got its own aura. It's all mystic connotations. They stood before you in obeisance. Whatever the hell you did, cobra, whether you killed my woman or not, you will end up in heaven because of the powers of the paramitas. So look, I don't have very strong views about these things, but there are people who say that this line actually intertextually connects with Lord Buddha being given shelter by Muchalin, the Cobra King Cobra, whatever, and the kind of merit or the merit he accumulated there was sufficient for generations of cobras to end up in heaven, that kind of thing. So tying it up with folk belief, folk lore, right? The second stanza, sky vertical, is where you are now shadowing the sun. So it's like his world has gone out of shape, because the sky is never vertical, sky is horizontal. That's how we imagine it. But it seems to have lost its alignment, probably curling around, and they whisper death stories. Death stories, at least in the stuff I have read, people try to understand this phrase in line with what we call, I don't know, in the Sinhala idiom, we say things like "Pau pirana kata," right, or whatever, right? It was only my woman Dunkirinya, the very lamp of my heart, that died. So, two very contrasting impressions. Now, for the purposes of the discussion I have initiated, to do with local idiom, alternative poetic sensibility, in addition to the use of local words like Veragoda, Paramita, etc., local references like to this cobra, intertextually transporting us to the Satsati, or whatever you call it. In addition to that, choice of words and the arrangement of words is also important. Lines like line 4, endlessly the people came to Veragoda. Closer to the colloquial spoken in Sinhala. Endlessly this is not how Elizabeth II or Charles III would say it, right? Endlessly the people came to Veragoda, right? And then lines like, it was only my woman Dunkirinya, the very lamp of my heart, that died. It's a very tangibly Asianist, Sri Lankanist kind of reference. The very lamp of my heart. It's not British, it's not English, right? So that kind of subtle infusion that turns our imagination away from British poetic, that inheritance, which we quite seamlessly, without questioning it, that we accept, that we use as the building blocks of our poetic expression. It turns our imagination away from that. And of course, another example for this can be found in the life of the folk poet. From the life of the folk poet, how to pronounce this is a problem, because many people they call him Vaisinho. Some people call it Isinho. Some people call it Sinho. Right? Professor Halpe used to call it Sinho, as I remember. Right? Some people call it Isinho. Some people call it Vaisinho. Chandana Disanayak of Sabaragamu University has actually written a newspaper article on this, which I found very engaging. Right? He's tried to actually figure out who this Sinho is and what are the chances. Apparently, he was living very close to Chandana's hometown. Apparently, he's trying to link the two. Okay. Apparently, it's a guy who used to gamble, and there was a gambling device called the Waikater. It's called the Waikater. Some kind of, I'm not very good with this, gambling games, but if someone here knows more, you can explain what the Waikater is. So this guy was an outsider who had come to that village, made a home there, and he used to quite malarially gamble. And the Waikater, the Y of the Kater has become an affix in his name. He's become wise in. Anyway, now let's look at this poem in the light of poetic idiom, right? Alternative poetic idiom, poetic sensibility. That's what we are focused on. Vaisinho cut the bamboo near Honeycatter, and from those wattles made his hut, and had nothing to cover it with, nothing, like 160 bales of straw. He's built a house for himself. He doesn't have the roofing material, 160 bales of straw. So he made his way to the Walauva at Iddamalgoda, and to the Manike said how poor he was, and how from his 20s he had made those lines of song, swearing before her all his faulties. So she said, wait for the Yala harvest, take the straw. Vaisinho said, oh, the rains are coming near, my woman fretting, her kid will get all wet. Then the kind Manike said, oh, then you take what straw you need from the behind shed. And Vaisinho, being a folk poet, and his lines being not all dead, the benison of the Manike of Iddamalgoda lives even today. Some people commenting on the poem, they like to show how, the Walauva was exploited by, the ordinary folk, while other people try to show the symbiotic existence between the village and the Walauva, the harmony of that kind of power arrangement, which is not very important. But what we see here is, at least what I see is, this Manike is quite shrewd. This guy suddenly turns up and says, I've been writing poems about you, Manike, by the way, from the time I was 20. Now I've built a house and I don't have roofing material. Can I have some straw? The Manike is like, cool. You can take them at the end of the Yala harvest. Then he says, but the problem is, it's going to rain very soon and my woman is worried. Kid will get wet. Okay, that's a good enough reason why you should come that way, right? Okay, then you go to the behind shed and take the straw. That's what the Manike says. Now, for us, the context we have set for ourselves, stanza 2, okay? So he made his way to the Walauva at Iddamalgoda, and to the Manike said how poor he was. To the Manike said how poor he was. Maniketa kiwa, right? Duk musukata, or whatever, right? So she said, wait for the Yala harvest, take the straw. Oh, the rains are coming near. My woman fretting, her kid will get all wet. Right? Mage ekkena hari mukak hari, my woman fretting, her kid will get all wet. Eyaage lamaya, meyaage lamaya. Right? So very tangibly, I would say, immersed with that folk resonance. My child වෙන්නේ කවදාවත්, right? ළමයින්ගේ තාත්තා, මෙයාගේ ළමයා, ළමයින්ගේ අම්මා, right? That kind of thing. Pawan and I, we were in a different forum. Last week we read this there, right? In a different forum. But the headman's son, okay? This is a different Manike, by the way, okay? It's not the one that Iddamalgoda, probably is a different Manike. Manike, says the headman's son, to her absence. Your note I read with trembling eyes. This is the note, the content. He has gone with the cart laden to the fair at Aladeni for 2 days even with the elder one. Right? My heart is fevered with your writing, Manike. I gave the boy 2 panams, and he left the comb of plantains you have sent. This is a clandestine relationship scenario. Okay? He has gone with the cart laden to the fair at Aladeni for 2 days even. And what has the Manike done? Kale kanakuteva plantains. Right? So I have your note, love, crumpled in my hand. I will come through your gate, Manike, at dusk with the Chris knife. May the Devas help you, Manike, and find you sitting, waiting, love, on the half wall of the veranda. Manike, moisten your lips with your tongue, as in other days, as my footsteps fall nearer in the half light. And say a prayer, even as the cart of Syria has gone away, say a prayer. In my fevered hand is the Chris knife, and my heart is dead. So here also in this poem, there are people who anticipate the narrator to be going on a deadly mission. That he's actually going to this Manike, the woman, so he's going to kill her, right, at the end of it, probably. I don't know, make love, whatever, kill her. But my feeling is, again, the Chris knife here is it's a suggestive, it's invested with innuendo, right? The Chris knife here, like the stalk in the earlier poem, it has a very definite sexual connotation, right? This seems to be a relationship that's been going on clandestine for a while, but I don't know whether you would agree to some degree that it's very powerfully invested with a local echo. For me, the most powerful is that comb of plantains she sends. It's again very phallic, the comb of plantains, right? Manike. So these kind of poems actually make us think about Wikkramasinha's poetic experiment a little bit seriously, right? This kind of poem. So look, we have been going at a stretch for almost 2 hours. I can just break for 5 minutes if you want, because I still have about 3 poems to look at, including Matis. Right? We still could bring it on the plate, Matis. We've been kind of, what's the word, tampering with it for a while. So I can take a very brief 5-minute break. It's 3:50. I can resume at 3:55, right? So when we resume, we will resume with Matis, right? Don't talk to me about Matis.
Vihanga?
Yeah.
I have a quick question, like, because we'll be starting with a different poem next time, so I just want to ask this. So like I think I'm being introduced to Lakdas like properly for the first time since reading him as a child. I think the only 2 we read were Cobra and the Life of the Folk Poet. So I think for the first time I'm sort of like seeing a diversity in his poetry that I never really noticed or knew of back then.
Yeah.
So something that just struck me that I wanted to ask what you felt about it or how you interpret this is that for example, like the poems like the Cobra and the Life of the Folk Poet that we were introduced to in our syllabuses is like directly written by Lakdas trying to sort of, how do you say it, like I don't want to say superimpose, but he's taking on the position of like the villager or like the lower middle class or a certain type of like character in his poetry, right? And those were what I was introduced to as a kid. But now when you read those, like the Death of Ashanti and like the Servant Girl and all of those, I feel like those have a very clear distinction where he's not attempting at all to be like the more Sinhalese or like the more village type of character, but he's speaking from his own perspective as like the feudal landlord or the aristocrat or like from his own lineage and his own ancestry. And I don't know, maybe there's like more diversity as we go along, but I'm just judging from the few poems that we've done so far. So I want to know, like, why do you think there's like a clear distinction, like in certain, like he's writing sometimes as like from the feudal perspective? And also I'd like to point out that for some reason, for me, poems like the Cobra did not sit well when I was reading them initially as like more of a teenager. And the reason they didn't is for the reason like similar to Patrick Fernando or Punyakanti Vijayanayaka's, like I didn't quite feel the authenticity of what he was trying to portray in terms of like that village, like for example, My Woman, Dun Kirinia and all of that. It didn't sound like there was something forced about it. It didn't quite come across as like, I don't know, authentic to me. So just some comments. I don't know, how do you respond or read to this? Read
I mean,
into
like to recenter the few points you shared, I think at one point you feel that poems like To a Servant Girl and Ashanti, that they come from experience, right?
Yeah.
Closer experience, a closer connection. And as you see some of these other poems, the more Sinhalized text is more, there is distance between, right, what is being described and the point of intervention. There is kind of a disconnect.
Yeah.
If I may rephrase it like that, will it still make sense if I put it that way? And also, you shared that when you first encountered poems like the Cobra, you felt that what's the word, that there was that they were contrived as creative work. You used a better word. You say you actually used a better word. You said they were forced. Is that what you said? No.
I can't quite remember.
Yeah. Okay. So something to that effect. That he's trying a bit too hard, right? He's trying a bit too hard. Now, there are a few other poems like this I have come across, but I really appreciate your first point, where some of the poems where the local poetic idiom, that experiment, kicks in. The narrator always or often, I shouldn't say always because I can't be sure it's always, but very often we come across of him being an outsider to that experience, right? Looking at it from a vantage, looking at it from a distance. Now, there is another poem which automatically comes to mind. It's called "Red the Coconuts," right? Red the Coconuts, red R-E-D, the coconuts. Again, I can see the point you are trying to make. I've never thought about this before, but I'm wondering whether one aspect could be that the poems like the Cobra, poems like From the Life of the Folk Poet, whether Wikkramasinghe is actually quite consciously engaging in what he's doing, right, with the idea of generating that syntactic play alone, right, whether to vocalize that idiom, to bring that idiom to life, is his main and ultimate goal. So it's not, So probably the purpose why he's writing that and why he's doing what he's doing is probably different from why he's writing Ashanti or to a servant girl, right? So it's like something you do with a certain degree of application. So that application pushes you back from the spontaneity or the authenticity, as you mentioned, that might come on. That's why maybe a poem like The Death of Ashanti might sound more authentic, right?
I'm curious to see what Oh Regal Blood is like. I'm curious to see what that collection is like, because those, like The Death of Ashanti and the Servant Girl, and even some of, like, I don't know, Discarded Tins, and even some of the more violent poems about like suicide and like murders and all of that, all those seemed much more like invested with authenticity and emotion rather than this experiment where he tries to like be a villager and write about like village life and stuff. So just what I felt. So
yeah, whether he becomes a villager, that I'm not very sure, because I have to be very careful when I say these things. Now, like if your reader interest permits, there are a couple of poems I would like you to look up. There's this one poem, this is also oft quoted. It's also oft very frequently anthologized. There's a poem called In Ancient Kothmale. In Ancient Kothmale, right? So people like Yasmin Gunaratna critiquing it, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 years ago, hell, it's 2020, maybe 50 years ago, right? I don't know. Yasmin Gunaratna has suggested that there are echoes of W.B. Yeats in that poem, right? This mythico king of Ireland kind of, that kind of imagery. I disagree, right? I disagree. But the way those poems are written have led academics and critics to read the poem in that way, in Ancient Kothmale, right? So he actually spent a lot of time in rural communities, Wikkramasingha, right? In rural communities, he, for example, that poem in Ancient Kothmale, there is an intertextual reference to that in Gamini Senaviratna's poem as well, to Lakdas. There's an epistle into Lakdas, right? So, so poems like that, I wonder whether you would like to look at them, because rather than, I wouldn't say he's trying to take the character of a villager, but at least he's trying to immerse with that surrounding. But his subject position is a little bit unclear to me, right? And I'm not trying to locate that clearly either, right? I've let the ambiguity play in my mind, right? I've not tried to find out who is he trying to be here. Now, interestingly, Ashanti comes as the last poem of O Regal Blood. Interesting. It's a collection that is very preoccupied with ancestry and family, right? That kind of thing.
yeah, because I think one of the questions I have regarding like Sri Lankan literature in English is what really gets lost. I think it's like writers of a certain class and with certain education and a background trying to write, when they try to sort of assimilate that Sinhalese or very, I don't know, even Tamil like, experience. I wonder what gets lost there. So that might be something that we could try to find out.
Yeah, also I think that experiment, now another important aspect when you look at that kind of experiment is that at what point in time does this experiment happen, right? So it's like 1960s, 1970s. So probably strategies that were tried out by writers around that time doesn't work anymore, because even as a new nation and as creative practitioners of a new nation, where we are in the 1960s is very different to where we are today, right? So sometimes something that is very put-offish is when those same strategies are tried out by contemporary writers because they feel that is what you should be doing, right? So there's some kind of vague feeling. This is how you should write a Sri Lankan story, right?
Also, haven't you noticed that by extension, like diasporic writing also does this, like trying to assimilate like the experience from far away. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and especially because the diasporic, at least in the older writers of the diaspora, sometimes, so there's a concept for this. I forget that what you call that concept, but the idea is that a sense of a place and a time gets fossilized in your imagination. It's like it doesn't evolve beyond a particular point, right? So one good example is Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost. Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost. This is a convenient example for me. It starts with this girl who has a very remote, very flimsy connection with the island, who's basically lived all her life in America or wherever. Returning to Sri Lanka, he steps off the plane at Katunayaka. He's been driven by a taxi driver. He tells the driver, "Can you take me to a place to drink some toddy?" Right? That looks very disconnected with, because the story is set in the late 80s, early 90s, and there's someone coming from far away. But maybe toddy taverns were more accessible, more commonplace in the 1950s and the 60s, which Ondaatje carries in his head, right? Okay, so now we come face to face with probably his most widely circulated, widely quoted, most widely read poem. Okay, don't talk to me about Matisse. Don't talk to me about Gauguin or even the earless painter, Van Gogh. Okay, and the woman reclining on a blood spread, the Aboriginal shot by the great white hunter Matisse, with a gun with two nostrils, the Aboriginal crucified by Gauguin, the syphilis spreader, the yellowed obesity. Don't talk to me about Matisse, the European style of 1900, the tradition of the studio where the nude woman reclines forever on a sheet of blood. Talk to me instead of the culture generally, how the murderers were sustained by the beauty robbed of savages. To our remote villages, the painters came, and our whitewashed mud huts were splattered with gunfire. All right, so there are two intermingling strands that I see in the poem. One is references to colonization, colonial commerce, right? Colonial enterprise. Then on the other side, European high art, 19th century and early 20th century. So Impressionism, the kind of big art we talk about, we go to look at, at these big galleries, and we stare at with a certain erudition, right? Radiating from our eyes, that kind of art, which is the iconism of colonial culture, right? So he sees that these two strands are intermingled, and also that one can be used in place of the other. They're interchangeable. That's why in the poem, halfway through, the artist and the identity of the artist and the identity of the colonizer gets mixed up. The Aboriginal shot by the great white hunter Matisse. There's no difference from Matisse, the painter, and the white hunter. Okay? Shooting with the gun and the spreading of syphilis, sexual exploitation. They very easily come on the same page. And also this woman that very often this is that standard nude model we find in studio art, right? So you have this woman very often reclining on a red bedspread, or the bedspread becomes a blood spread, because the way probably local women were abused, killed, right, tortured, whatever, that kind of gets what's the word, that emerges out of this woman reclining in a studio to be painted, to be drawn, right, as a model. He says, don't talk to me about any of this. Talk to me instead of the culture generally. Because if you do that, if you speak about the culture generally, there is space for exploitation and abuse to be factored in the discussion. Right? So there is no hierarchization, there is no valorization, there's no fetishism, right? There's no fetishism. You can have a more open overall conversation. How murderers were sustained by the beauty robbed of savages. So here, it's a very widely importable idea. It can start from the draining of resources, minerals, right? Physical resources, but also human resources, right? So slavery, everything, how the beauty of the savages were robbed for the murderers to be sustained as the masters of the universe or whatever. To our remote villagers, the painters came. Painters / hunters, they're both the same. And our whitewashed mud huts was splattered with gunfire. Whitewash is a very interesting, it's a very interesting adjective there, whitewashed, right? Because it also has a very, I mean, nowadays people don't use these kind of adjectives actually. Especially in sports, we don't use these adjectives anymore. It was very common probably till about the 1990s to say a series was whitewashed, right? If there's a kind of a, let's say, a absolute result, if there's an absolute result, let's say England cricket team tours the West Indies, wins 3-0, it's a whitewash. People don't say it anymore, right? Mud huts were splattered with gunfire. Now, this is the quotation. Can you remember? Michael Ondaatje uses in that excerpt, which we started the session with. Michael Ondaatje, right? He uses this, but he doesn't engage with it in any way. I don't see a purpose of giving this quotation. The only purpose it serves is to show that Michael Ondaatje has come across Lakdas Wikkramasinha, right? Because if you actually comment or if you take this a little seriously, you can actually engineer or architect an entire deconstruction of a book like Running in the Family, starting here, right? And of course, a set piece from O Regal Blood, poem titled Weapons, dedicated to Don Cornelius Pinto Javardhana, right? One would always love weapons. So this is a poem about his family armory, basically. So just to illustrate that fixation, right? One would always love weapons as women love clothes, and some with a sociable style. But swords, guns, shedding blood, and then the rain following you out, the grass gleaming. My great-grandfather would almost certainly have lived up to now, keeping his 38 guns in the house. For weapons have a way of ensuring one's future. One breech loader still remains a family legend. It could break the trunk of a full-grown coconut tree. I recall these weapons with pride. Weapons which have rusted, are broken, but held in the throes of the same blood. The few remaining taken as a token of my life. I look on them with love, washing them with kerosene, sometimes with coconut oil, handling them sometimes for hours at night, in unbroken chasm, keeping the wake. For me, there is again a very powerful, unmistakable, right, innuendo that kind of works through the poem. The gun as a phallic symbol, right? And also in the same way that the armory is what remains in this family. these guns rusted up, right? As those are the only detritus of a family that was great once. Okay, it also kind of draws attention to the breakdown of a particular kind of feudal or, you know, masculine or male-centric universe. So the remaining gun is something which you play with into the late hours of the night in an unbroken chasm, keeping yourself awake. It's like a romantic masturbation with the past, right? It's like a romantic masturbation with the past, and therefore he kind of narrows the gap of the two ideas towards the end of the poem. So as a concluding movement to this, I want to look at this other poem, which is again set in the family domain. It's titled Visiting an Aunt. Because you might agree that in Wikkramasinha's writing, there's a lot of gaps and fissures, a lot of things happening, a lot of possibility. Even in the Ashanti poem, servant to a servant girl, that poem, right? Even in this last poem we read, regarding the family gunnery, the armory, lot of space for possibility. Now let's look at this one, Visiting an Aunt. It was after a decade almost, and now again I was in Kaluthara, carrying a comb of plantains that I'd bought. Again reminds us of Manike in the Headman's Son, right? This comb of plantains makes after I got off the bus at the bus stand, I went to see my aunt, Joanna, right? So I include this poem very especially because Johan is with us in the group, but he has temporarily left. So he missed the thunder. He has temporarily left the group, Johan, right? Oh, he's there, right? So I keep you in mind when I include this poem. I went to see my aunt, Johanna. I remembered as I turned into the narrow drive that led to her house that the last time I'd seen her before my exile from my relations was at the death of her husband, my uncle. She was surprised to see me. "How old you look," she said, as soon as she saw me. "As old as me." Her hair had turned as white as the pepper vine that I remember running up the areca trees in her garden. We sit in that old familiar hall with a large framed picture facing us of her long-bearded, long-named father. On a table to our side stood a vase of red anthuriums, drying but curiously never wilting. And meanwhile, as it had become natural with us, I had nothing to say. Right? I'm fast forwarding a little bit to the next stanza. Smell of kerosene drifted in, and in the pupils of her eyes, I saw how dismal I must look. There was compassion in them, and I thought, vaguely listening to her, what an alert mind she had. Though now in her 90s, my aunt had an extremely clear mind, like all her people. A quarter mile back of the house was the beach. I thought the waves of the sea as they fell were like a comb of green plantains, or perhaps a brown hand, or perhaps I wondered as to what I was to say next. And as we sipped our tea, she asked me finally, with a kind of smile, if I was married, and so on now. And I listened to myself, giving her the garbled version of my state. Now, you will agree with me that we read about 30 lines of poetry, right? But nothing happens. We read 30 lines of poetry, but in the poem, nothing happens. But inside the poem, a lot is happening. There's a lot of possibility inside the poem, right? It's at a glance all clear, but nothing is clear. So he says that the narrator says he's been exiled from the family. He's been kind of probably declared the black sheep of the family, or he's gone away from the family. He's been away for a long time. He comes back to Aunt Joanna, who's surprised to see him. They don't have much to say. He brings the comb of plantains to Aunt Joanna, right? There's a lot of tension regarding what this relationship actually could be, must have been in the past. Could this relationship be a reason for him being shunned by the family, him going away, right? Coming back, because towards the tail end, his mind goes to the sea waves, the waves of the sea, and once again the comb of plantains appear. Right? He's thinking of the plantains, and also right at the end, this question after a pregnant silence, this question. So, are you married now? When an elderly woman you've been familiar with asks this question, that's a giveaway, right? Are you married now? And I listen to myself giving her a garbled version of my state, right? So the family interest in Wikkramasingha's writing, it's not, I would say, straight-lined. It's not linear. It's not innocent. It's not the kind of family history we see in the salmon advertisement, right? The Tinmalu advertisement. It's not that kind of family history. It's full of possibility. There is a lot of, what's the word? The word is subversion, right? There's a lot of subversion, a lot of tension at play within. Okay. Now, to kind of, as a final movement to this, I want to go back to Ondaatje, where he talks about the poetry and how he drowned at Mount Lavinia. Powerful and angry poet. So by virtue of our discussion, we might identify this as a reduction, isn't it? It's a reduction. It's a powerful reduction, powerful and ignorant reduction. Wikkramasingha can be angry, right? Wikkramasingha can be so many things, but to reduce him in these words, it does a disservice to the range and the variety. Pawan used this word, that there is a diversity in the poetry that he offers. So I think in the same way, writers like Ondaatje, who make these kind of conclusions, because these writers are taken very seriously. I would say even our education department does a gross disservice by, as Pawan said, like when we were schooling, you have the Cobra and Isinyo, and you think that is Lakdas Wikkramasinha, and you don't even you don't want to check out this guy anymore, right? You're like, good he drowned, right? Good he drowned. So part of the deal was to explode these kind of absolute statements and myths, right, into which these people have been coffined, right, into which these people have been coffined. Lakdas was 2 years ahead of me at St. Thomas's. We studied in the same halls, but probably if you look at some of Ondaatje's writing, he's a great writer. He writes pretty well, but politically speaking, Ondaatje and Wikkramasingha possibly went on 2 tracks, though they come from the same institute, though they studied in the same halls. They can be called the 2 parrots who fell on the 2 cans after that proverbial storm, right? The 2 parrots, and he reads the concluding stanza of Mathis in his Bullers Road residence. Bullers Road is Bullers Road Bauddha currently? So Bullers Road residence. He reads the concluding stanza of Mathis. He quite rightly doesn't read the opening stanza. Right? I don't think that would look a good quotation in a book that has to be sold, right, globally. So this is a much better stanza to put in your book. All right, so yeah, good to have a bit of chat if people are up for it. We have about probably another 20 minutes. We can go up to 20 minutes.
I wouldn't mind coming in on what Pawan said. Hi, Pawan, again for the second time today. Um, she was also in a class in the morning.
Okay.
So she talked of the two poems that she studied. I probably have less experience than you all with Lakdas Wikkramasinha's poems, not having done the local syllabus at all. But for A levels, I remember, I think even in my batch, we did these two poems. And some of the thinking, Pawan said she felt like there was a disconnect. And I felt like the syllabus exoticizes what is Sri Lankan or the rural Sri Lankan village by selecting those two poems from Wikkramasinha.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of even the worshipping of the cobra, the threat of the cobra, it's very exotic to the kind of student who does English literature in this country. Like most rural schools don't even offer English language anymore. Or even if that, it's not said grade 6, grade 7, someone who grapples with this kind of rurality or dangers does not have the opportunity to engage with a poem like this.
Mm.
And the people who are engaging with it, even critics or writing, comes from a certain milieu of, English educated, living in some sort of urban city. And I don't know if the syllabuses are made by people like that, but I feel like that there is some connection between the fact that Sri Lanka is almost, the exotic of Sri Lanka, the rurality is celebrated in those two poems in some form, in the teaching of it. Whether Lakdas Wikkramasinha intended it to be that way or not.
No, you're right, actually. Now, I mean, when the syllabus, so the cycle you are referring to is 97 to 2010, that syllabus. So when that changed and the next cycle came in, I think the poem called The Poet. There are two poems called The Poet by Wikkramasinha. The Poet 1 was included in the syllabus. Again, relatively, I would say, very harmless. It doesn't take you to the deep end of Lakdas Wikkramasinha in any way. One reason could also be, Manik, I'm just kind of groping in the dark here. One reason also could be that, let's say, the grooming of academics. You have, let's say, 10 years of the academy being groomed on limited material of a writer. That the material that you are exposed to, especially if it's not your research area, that becomes the the horizon of your understanding of that writer. So for Wikkramasinha, I think that has happened to some degree. So as I said right at the beginning, someone like Nihal Fernando, maybe he had a personal interest in this kind of poetry, or whether it was a calculated choice that he saw something worthy of sharing at length. Wikkramasinha's corpus shared with at least my class and probably my immediate groups at Perera when I was a student, that easily went to about 20 poems, right? Easily went to about 20 poems. But I don't see this happening in other places. So you keep on working with a limited amount of material that comes to you, and after a while that material becomes the be all and the end all, right? And then you try to frame the creative world of the writer based on that material. So I think to some degree that could also be part of the problem. But I also agree with your points regarding the imagination that goes into syllabus design and syllabus framing. There's a lot of thinking to be done there. Yeah.
If I can also add a bit to that, Vihanga, like another thing I find very interesting is when Monica was teaching the class, like for us personally this morning, she was also talking about like when you're reading critically, first you look at the what, and then you look at the how and the why, and then you look at the so what, right? I feel like the so what aspect of it is not considered like in our syllabuses when we're like constructing most of our like A-level or O-level literature. I don't think we've put enough thought into the so what of why we are including certain texts, especially Sri Lankan English literature. So just like a comment, like maybe that's something we should.
So when the syllabus cycle was reset, the last two syllabus cycles, I think Pawan's point can be very well appreciated in that context, because some of the poetry in particular that has been in play from 2010 to 2018, and since 2018, the current syllabus in place, right? So what are those three questions?
So when you're reading critically something like a text, it's the what of it, the how and the why, how is it constructed, and then the so what.
Yeah. So I mean, like when you take these last two syllabus cycles, there is another question that comes to mind. So after so what, it's like so what, so with what? So with what do I kill myself? That kind of thing, right? Because it looks super random. And I'm very sure if I was an A-level lit student at this point in time, I might actually think twice continuing the subject after A-levels. Right? Super random. Just take a look at the poetry that is on offer. This is more true to poetry than some of the other genres, right? Poetry on offer. Very random. Even some of the ancients, so to speak, some of the classical writers, right? People like Dryden, Pope included, very random excerpts from their work. So yeah, again, a big problem to do with imagination.
That was a little question I had. I wanted to check, Vihanga, I wasn't sure, were the two dedications to the same grandmother? I mean, this is just like a very not so relevant question, but were they to the same grandmother or for two different?
My memory is that there are two people, but these are like probably very influential, heavy duty people in the family lineup, right? So
he has an element of like a massive celebration of his lineage and ancestry, doesn't he?
And that very rarely comes out in the kind of readings we do. That because my feeling is that element is probably more crucial than others when we try to map the guy, when we try to pin him down. Because you need to, one thing we don't do sufficiently in rudimentary explorations of poetry and all that, we have done away with some of the necessary biographical elements that actually give us a grip of who the guy is, right? So we focus more on the text, but you can't do it without figuring out the more fundamental aspects of the writer where he comes from, what his thinking is, who his people are, and what kind of connection does he have with them, right? So yeah, Johan says, since this session evolves around Lakdas, did his contemporaries or disciples talk about his influence of subsequent poetry? The so what, right? Disciples openly talk about his influence on subsequent poets, right? Okay, sorry. So no, you're right. Actually, Wikkramasinha is probably one of those people who have left quite a, let's say, an impact, both in readers, writers, as well as critics. Among Sri Lankan poets, I'm not saying that this is like great critical literature, but if you actually like invest yourself sufficiently, there is a certain amount of critical literature available on Wikkramasinha on a range of themes that interest him, right? And conversation has been there about the kind of inspiration he has imparted to others, and inspiration others have drawn from him, right? So, for example, a name I dropped in the course of this discussion is Malinda Senaviratne, the great nationalist English poet in Sri Lanka. But Malinda, I think, has had or he's tried to read Wikkramasinghe quite deeply. I personally don't know what kind of personal communication they have had, but there is reason to believe that Lakdas was known to Malinda's father, Gamini Senaviratne, right, who was a poet. And probably Malinda knew him too, because Malinda was born in 1965. So even in 1978, he would have been an adolescent, an early teen. There is a poem titled for Lakdasa. He has published in 1998. It comes in his collection Epistles, right, collected in 1998. So that is there. An interest in Lakdas Wikkramasinha has been fired in people like me, who take as his primary field of research Sri Lankan writing, right? So I haven't written academically a lot about Lakdas, but in less formal communications, newspapers, blogs, etc. I have visited the topic Lakdas quite a few times, and in my sweeping way, the way I generalize, I have even forecasted an extinction of Lakdas in the next within the next decade, right? And then I get the news that Ondache and Aparna Halpe are actually collecting his poetry. Whether it'll speedy up the extinction, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, right? So yeah, so to answer your question, I think his ghost, right? His ghost or his legacy, it has been transferred to subsequent generations of writers and critics. So there are critics who feel that in the last 75 years of post-independence Sri Lankan writing, he is the finest poet Sri Lanka has produced, both in the way he invests himself in the poetry, experiments with it, and also the range of the poetry. So if that is something to go by, it's very sad that he's been dead for 44 years and we haven't found a successor, right, for the kind of poetic investment he had. Now, interestingly, a point I have raised in that article I will share at the end of this session is as to what Wikkramasinghe would have done had he not died in 78, right? That is also very important. It's very important as much as the way we live and how we live. It's also important to figure out when you must die, right? Because 78 is an iconic year. That's where the liberal economy takes over, right? Open economy, whatever. And in the next 20 years, we have a war, right? Again, partly, I would say, I won't even say partly, again, fueled by the neoliberal agenda. The country is pushed into a war against, forces emerging from the Tamil consciousness, the Tamil quarter of the community, right? And then after the war, we have violence against the Muslims. Now, with the kind of very radical Sinhalist sensibility this guy actually demonstrates, I wonder what our assessment, people like myself, I mean, I don't have a decisive political position, but if someone is to gauge me, I'm very sure I will be positioned more towards a liberal orientation. That's my guess. But I wonder how people like myself would have looked at what Wikkramasinghe would have produced in subsequent years and what that production would have been. Because my feeling, rereading Lakdas Wikkramasinghe as an older, mature reader, right? So reading Lakdas Wikkramasinghe in my 30s, basically, is that there is a lot that escapes the eye that can very easily fall off the table, which upon closer investigation keeps on opening windows and windows through which you can really enrich your understanding of the poet, not only the poet, but also Sri Lankan society and the evolution of the Sri Lankan identity from the colonial to the post-colonial, right? So if this merits some of your energies and your preoccupations, as a avid reader of Sri Lankan poetry and Lakdas Wikkramasinha's writing, this is my invitation, and I'm ready to have that conversation with you outside the confines of this workshop.